You've seen it. Maybe it was your mother, sometime in her 40s, walking out of a family dinner she'd spent years dreading, just quietly gathering her coat, saying goodbye without apologizing, and leaving before the argument started. Maybe it was a colleague who stopped laughing at things she didn't find funny, who started ordering what she actually wanted at restaurants instead of what seemed reasonable, who cut her hair short or grew it out, or wore the color everyone said was too bold and just kept moving. Maybe it was you. And the strange thing isn't that it happened. The strange thing is how it felt to watch it. There was no dramatic announcement, no breakdown that preceded it. Just a woman who, somewhere around her 40s, seemed to become more herself, less monitored, less edited. People around her called it different things. Some said she'd become difficult. Some said she'd stopped caring. Some said she'd finally found herself. They were all describing the same thing, but only one of them got it right. To understand what shifts in a woman's 40s, you have to go back much further. Back to a room she sat in when she was 7, maybe 9, maybe 13, where she first understood that her value was conditional. Not because anyone said so directly, but because the messages were everywhere. Be nice, don't be too loud. Be pretty but not vain about it. Be smart but don't make him feel stupid. Be confident but not aggressive. Be kind without being a pushover. Have opinions but not too many. Take up space but not that much space. She absorbed all of it because she was paying attention. And what she learned at 7, at 9, at 13 was that approval wasn't automatic. It had to be earned, and it could be lost. So she started managing, editing her sentences before she said them, reading rooms before she entered them, calibrating how much of herself was safe to show. By the time she was in her 20s, she'd gotten very good at it. She knew which version of herself got the warmest reception. She knew which opinions to soften, which ambitions to downplay, which feelings to keep quiet until she was alone. She didn't call this performance. She called it being considerate. The performance is expensive. Not in any single moment. One softened sentence costs almost nothing. One swallowed opinion leaves barely a trace. One evening spent performing warmth you don't feel drains a small, forgettable amount, but it compounds. By her late 30s, most women have been performing for decades. Performing at work, the version of herself that doesn't threaten, doesn't overstep, stays pleasant even when she isn't. Performing at home, the version that holds things together without making anyone feel the weight of what that holding costs her. Performing with friends, with strangers, with her own family, always calibrating, always adjusting, always taking up exactly the amount of space she calculated was allowed. And somewhere in that accumulation, something starts to erode. It's not dramatic, it's more like a quiet exhaust. Like a phone battery that never quite charges to full anymore. She's present at every gathering, but increasingly somewhere else inside herself. She says yes when she means no, and afterward she feels not generous but hollow. She does the right thing and feels nothing. She gets the approval she worked for, and it doesn't land the way it used to, because approval from the outside can never fill something that's broken on the inside. There's a pattern researchers have observed in women across cultures during middle age, a gradual disenchantment with the returns on social performance. The emotional investment stops paying dividends, and something deeper starts surfacing in its place. Here's what most people miss about this decade. The 40s aren't just a time in life. They're a neurological shift. As women move through midlife, several things happen in parallel that have nothing to do with giving up and everything to do with clarity. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for long-term thinking, consequence evaluation, and pattern recognition, reaches a particular kind of maturity in midlife. You've accumulated enough experience that your brain processes social dynamics faster. You see the game more clearly. You recognize manipulation earlier. You feel the cost of inauthenticity more acutely, because you've paid it enough times to know exactly what it takes from you at the same time. At the same time, there's a recalibration that happens around mortality, not in a morbid way, more like a quiet arithmetic. 22. The future stretches in front of you and there's always more time to be who you're supposed to be. By 42, time looks different. The horizon is visible. And when the horizon is visible, you stop walking in directions that don't matter. Researchers who study well-being across the lifespan have noticed something counterintuitive. Life satisfaction in many people doesn't steadily increase or decrease, it curves. A low point often falls somewhere in the midlife years, but coming out of that low, something shifts. Values clarify. Emotional regulation improves. The need for external validation weakens, not because people become cold, but because they become more honest about what actually matters to them. For many women, 40 is not the beginning of loss. It's the beginning of accuracy. She stops apologizing for her calendar. She stops laughing at things she doesn't find funny. She stops explaining herself to people who've already decided who she is. She stops trying to be what she was in her 20s, because her 20s were half performance, and she knows that now. She stops finishing conversations she's already done with. She stops attending events out of guilt that she should attend. She stops giving her real emotional energy to relationships that take it and return nothing. She stops shrinking her opinions in rooms where her opinion is inconvenient. She stops waiting for permission. These aren't small changes. To people around her, they look like changes in personality, like she's become harder, more selfish, less available. But she isn't harder. She's less afraid. Those are different things. Fear makes you compliant, and compliance looks like kindness. When the fear reduces, the compliance reduces too, and people who benefited from the compliance call it a loss of warmth. What they mean is, she's stopped making herself uncomfortable so they can stay comfortable. That was never warmth. That was service. When a woman in her 40s stops performing, the people around her experience something that feels like abandonment, because they were used to the performance. The co-workers who relied on her to smooth over conflict, they had to start managing their own. The family members who counted on her to absorb tension, they felt it without a buffer for the first time. The friends who needed her to always be available suddenly found her with limits. And limits, to people who've never encountered them from you, feel like rejection. So they find language for it. She's changed. She's difficult now. She's become cold, selfish, lost. She used to be so warm. What they're really saying is, the version of her that existed for our comfort no longer exists. And they're right. It doesn't. Here's what that looks like from the inside, though. It doesn't feel like coldness. It feels like the first deep breath after a very long time of breathing shallow. It feels like putting down something heavy you carried for so long you forgot you were carrying it. It feels like arriving somewhere you didn't know you were traveling toward. It feels like the quietest possible form of freedom. There's a concept in psychology called authenticity, the alignment between your internal experience and the way you present yourself outwardly. When that alignment is low, the psychological cost is high. Anxiety, low self-esteem, a nagging, chronic sense that something is wrong, even when nothing visible is wrong. When researchers look at authenticity across the lifespan, they find something consistent. It tends to increase with age. Older adults, and midlife women specifically, report higher levels of self-acceptance, clearer personal values, and less concern with social comparison than younger cohorts. This isn't about cynicism. It isn't about giving up on connection. The women who go through this shift don't become isolated. They become more intentional. They invest more deeply in fewer relationships. They develop a cleaner sense of what's worth their time and what isn't. One framework that keeps appearing in midlife research is the idea of ego integrity, a concept describing the capacity to look at your life honestly, accept the choices you've made, and move forward with a coherent sense of self rather than a performance of one. The women who develop this in their 40s don't become less social. They become more honest. And honesty, to people who are still performing, looks like coldness. It isn't. There's a kind of invisibility that women are told to fear in middle age. The idea that society stops seeing you once you cross a certain age, a certain body, a certain version of desirability. And for some women, that fear is real. But there's another kind of invisibility, the one you create yourself. When you stop performing, you become harder to use. You become harder to flatter, harder to manipulate, harder to steer with other people's discomfort. You stop being the reliable absorber of tension that everyone counted on. You become, in a certain sense, less visible to the machinery that needed you pliable. And that invisibility isn't a loss. It's the first time in a long time that the person taking up space in the room is actually you. Not the edited version, not the calibrated version, not the version that arrived in the room already scanning it for what to adjust. Just you, taking up exactly the space you take up. Saying what you actually think, leaving when you're done, staying when you mean it. Women who reach this place don't call it freedom at first. They call it exhaustion with the alternative. But eventually, if they sit with it long enough, they recognize what it is. It's the beginning of being fully present for a life that is actually theirs. Somewhere in her 40s, she stopped explaining herself, stopped softening her opinions, stopped staying in rooms that cost her more than she could afford. People called it coldness. She called it the first honest breath she'd taken in decades.